Hello everyone, welcome to our final presentation for our Gould Lab, Drugs and the American Experience. Today we've been asked to answer the question, what is the problem with drugs? However, we have to answer it from a parochial, more common sense view. So, we turned to our peers in college to ask them what the problem was. The four key takeaways we got from these oral testimonies was that there's a lack of common understanding of the context of when drugs are used, there's a negative feedback loop associated with drug use and selling, that the American ideology simply isn't compliant with solving the problem with drugs, and fourth, that we are such a divided society in our takeaways that we will never be able to bridge specific ideological chasms.
First word that comes to mind is bad, unhealthy, and unsafe.
Okay.
I feel like they have a lot of dangers associated with them that aren't present in other things that are consumed for pleasure, like alcohol.
Can get really addicted. I actually learned about this in psych disorders.
Hell yeah, you did.
Because some drugs are so potent that after one use, you get addicted, you get hooked, and then you're just gonna like keep going back. It's so hard when, especially if you take like some heroin, don't take the fen, bro. Like, you are gonna get addicted immediately. So that's what the problem is with like very hard drugs. I think drugs that are like more party vibes, psychedelics, I think those are chiller, and like if you use them responsibly, then I respect that. But not the fen.
The first problem with drugs that we identified is that there's very much a lack of common understanding around, especially in American society, but society in general, about what a drug is. And I think there's a lot of things, like you point out, you say, hey, here's a tree, and people can have an image of what a tree is, or here's a class, and people think, well, this is what a class is. But drugs don't have that same effect, and you say a drug, and people's mind go, okay, are you talking about marijuana, or are you talking about heroin injections? And a lot of the problem of drugs stems from that misunderstanding about what it is, both what the drug is, the impact it has, and the context it can be used in. The biggest issue with this lack of common understanding is that it's impossible to create policy that overarchingly addresses the differences between the context of drug use, the effects that the drugs have, and the different drugs. For example, Professor Posen talked about in his visit the Native American case of peyote, where they successfully legalized the report case peyote. But then after that, a bunch of different groups would just form religious groups just so that they could use their drugs and use that as an excuse. So that's an example of just trying to misunderstanding a certain religious context or various contexts that drugs are used in, where some are acceptable and some might be socially acceptable as well, and others are not. And policy that tries to address all of it is ineffective.
I think as someone who's Latina, a lot of the times, something that's very destructive in my community is that people believe that Latinos are the main reason why there are drugs in the U.S., and that's definitely not the true case.
The second problem that we've identified with the problem is the negative feedback loop that surrounds drug use, selling, and policing, and that is the radicalized feedback loop. One where policing doesn't actually end drug use, but makes it even more entrenched into the problem and into our society. And it makes it easier for us to understand this feedback loop when we hear from people who've actually lived through these experiences. To analyze this problem, I wanted to start with a story of Curtis, who was an ex-dealer and user from Southeast DC. And he talks about his experience after his very first arrest. Here he says, I got out and couldn't get a job. Who wants to hire a felon? So I went right back to what I knew. What choice did I have? That's the loop that we emphasized before. Here, policing leads to incarceration, which leads to social exclusion, which brings people right back to dealing and using drugs. And this is what we talked about when we mentioned Curtis, like many others who struggle under a structure that actively punishes survival. And this is exactly what we see when we talk about the problem and how people perceive drugs in society, because once you get into the world of drugs, it's really hard to get out without an immense amount of help and support from society, and that's what marginalizes drug users and the leaders even more?
I think that with drugs, it's really easy to become addicted to them, and our society doesn't make it super easy for people who's addicted to them to get out of that addiction. So maybe it's like kind of support, and often addiction is interlinked with other issues like poverty. So it's kind of like a negative feedback loop that just reinforces itself.
The third part that we have identified with the problem is American ideology. The US has a long and complex history based off of ideas from history's greatest philosophical thinkers, ranging from ancient Greece to the English Enlightenment era. These ideas sort of range from natural law to the social contract, shaping the US's cornerstone values that it was founded on, such as individual liberties and freedoms to respect of the supreme law. This history has produced Americans' heightened sense of individualism, and in combination with capitalism has resulted in a culture of neglect and removing oneself from collective responsibility. We have talked with David Farber in one of our past workshops, and he himself has told us his experience living in a space where a lot of people were dealing with issues of addiction, and I'm sure that many of us have shared similar experiences and sort of even witnessed the problem that we have identified. America's age of neoliberalism and Reagan's rhetoric of pulling yourself up from the bootstraps has sort of propagated the myth of personal responsibility, along with the American criminal justice system, which is based off of punitive justice, focusing on reprimanding and punishing people for their choices and dealing out the harshest punishments possible. However, David Farber sort of shows us in his work sort of shifting his perspective and sort of framing the choices of individuals during the war on drugs as sort of rational and sort of us changing our narrative and our perspective. Still, even after the war on drugs has ended, Americans still feel conflicted over the law's response in response to increasing rates of drug use and a continuous feeling of social decay, still while purposely removing themselves from collective responsibility of addressing the complex and overarching problems, including homelessness and drug use, potentially highlighting problems with the human nature and sort of how humans themselves respond to sort of issues with collective action.
The fourth conflict we'll be talking about is the conflict of the societal division in American society, which stems from America's ideology of everyone for themselves. An oral history included, as well as a triplet, talks about a drug dealer and how he resorted to selling drugs because he cannot provide for himself. This lack of economic stability pushed him and his mentality of taking care of himself to sell drugs to others, knowing that these could affect the society around him. He understands also that resorting to these methods is not a moral failing. However, it's adapting to the society that he lives in, knowing that he must be able to provide for himself. Another one is a Vietnam War veteran who took to using drugs because of the situation that he was in, looking for a way out. A lot of the people that utilize drugs are not there looking to harm others or even harm themselves, looking for a place of solace and refuge from the situation that they're in.
Some of them are cool, some of them aren't. I feel like
I feel like I've tried a lot of them, and there's good. It depends on.
It depends on what you're doing. Definitely, yeah.
Okay.
I think everything in moderation. You gotta be safe.
And even when you think about a common sense understanding within a very narrow class, race, social status, for example, upper middle class white folks, there are two sides, right? There is no one common sense understanding, even amongst them. On the one hand, you have this progressive, liberal, academic elite that thinks that, we need to decriminalize, we need to have much lower restrictions on accessibility for drugs. But then they neglect to remember that, as David Farber points out, as Michael Fortner points out, that a lot of Black communities wanted more intervention, wanted stricter sentencing, wanted more police in their communities. On the other hand, you also have this elite group on the more conservative end that's very scared of drugs, but they don't realize that their own children are abusing Percocet and Xanax, and that their own children are some of the biggest consumers of music, films, pop culture in general that promotes drug use. So there is really no common sense understanding, even in such a narrow microcosm, and it's very unfeasible to expect that we can have an understanding across everyone in America.
Another problem is that people don't know what to think of drugs when they haven't tried drugs, and especially when the context for drug use varies from person to person. As Vania mentioned, you can be a Vietnam War veteran who resorts to drugs to escape from PTSD and severe anxiety. Or you could be a Carl Hart who has a very comfortable setting and knows his limits and takes it in doses that he is scientifically equipped to understand. The problem with legislating drugs, or especially going through courts, as David Posen mentions, yes, countries like Canada, South Africa have made it through judicial rulings to loosen their drug laws. But in the US, when we don't have a common sense understanding of drugs, let alone people using drugs, we can't really legislate or rule on these issues when people just don't know what the effects are and can't relate personally to the effects.
And when we do try and enforce or legislate on these issues, it's mostly handled on the federal level by the Drug Enforcement Agency. And this is particularly nebulous because, first of all, it changes from administration to administration. As David Posen mentioned in our class, the DEA is responsible for classifying these drugs in their schedules and setting these sentences, and also doing the enforcement part. So it really is a big conflict of interest that depends on who's in control, how they view drugs, how they view criminality. And then obviously by state, you get all of these different policies. You see Oregon's Measure 110 trying to decriminalize drug possession completely failed, and within a few years, they end that. So this constant uncertainty of how drugs are enforced means that we can never have one set understanding.
In conclusion, the problem with drugs is that Americans villainize what they do not understand. Because drugs are such a multivariable issue, no one will ever have a true common understanding of the context of a drug being used, which drug is being used, and why it is being used. To police a drug is to police a massive social issue, which many people do not understand. We've gone from eras where marijuana was considered the devil's lettuce to now where it's legalized in so many states, and many people deem themselves, quote, California sober. And now we've seen other places where they are theorizing that they could maybe legalize heroin in small uses. And that is our problem. We will never be able to truly police drugs because we have such ideological chasms between us, whether it's from household to household or city to city, country to country, that we will never be able to have a true idealistic way to police drugs.